Greetings and thank you for attending this webinar. My name is Chris McDougal and I am the Director of the Archives and Library here at the museum. Today I'm going to provide you with a wider view of the current temporary exhibit that is on display here at the museum. Our temporary exhibit space is located near the front entry to the George Bush Gallery. The current exhibit in this space examines a part of the U.S. Navy that ceased to exist in 1942 and was called the Asiatic Fleet. To explore the fleet, this exhibit uses an aspect of stamp collecting called Naval Covers and some interesting artifacts from our collection that are not normally on display. First, a little info about the Asiatic Fleet. The Asiatic Fleet was formed in 1902 and deployed to the Philippine and China area. It was there to protect American interests and existed for almost half a century. So I imagine you're wondering what a naval cover is. Well, here at the beginning of the exhibit is a basic explanation of what a naval cover is. Collectors use the term naval cover to refer to envelopes and postcards that have been mailed from or relate to naval ship, base, or event. Post offices were first established on U.S. Navy ships in 1908. When envelopes are mailed, a postmark denoting the place and date of mailing is made over the postage in order to cancel it so that stamps cannot be reused. Each Navy ship had at least one postmark that included the name of the ship from which the envelope was mailed. During the 1930s, naval covers with distinguishing printed designs known as cachets were introduced. A variety of cachets were eventually designed and sent to ships for cancellation, and a large following among cachet collectors soon developed. Some cachets were made for particular ships and certain events tied to it. Common events included ships launchings, anniversaries, or notable cruises. More generic designs were also offered in association with holidays or historical events. After World War II began, the number and variety of naval covers diminished. They are still created and collected today, but the popularity attained during the 1930s has not been revived. Now that you know a little more about what naval covers are, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples that are not in this exhibit. The first example was postmarked on the USS Dauphine. And as you can see here, the particular date it was postmarked was September 2nd, 1945. The significance of that date is alluded to in the design that you see here on the cover. That ship was located in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrender was signed on USS Missouri. The second example was postmarked on the USS Nimitz. The USS Nimitz was launched in 1972, and as I alluded to before, the significant event here is that the ship was being deployed to the Mediterranean in 1986. Now I want to show you some of the more interesting artifacts and cachets that are in this exhibit. Over here we have one of the more interesting items in this exhibit. Even though our collection is focused on World War II, we do have a few items that extend before and after the war. Most of the items that are related to the ships in this exhibit would fit that category. This flag is quite unusual because it is from the USS Langley. USS Langley was the first aircraft carrier in the U.S. fleet. We're very lucky to have it. And over here you will see one of the covers from USS Langley. As you can see, it was postmarked on July 4th, 1935, and as you can also see, some of these covers have humorous content. The sailor here is holding 2 firecrackers. Over here is another 4th of July cover, and this one is from the USS Houston. What I would like to show you is another cover that is also related to the USS Houston. As you can see, this cover has a photograph of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on it. USS Houston was his favorite ship. Whenever he took a cruise somewhere, that was the ship that he traveled on. Over here, we have some very unique and unusual items that came to us that are all related to the USS Houston. The cruise book that you see here was issued specifically for one of President Roosevelt's cruises. It's very unique. I don't know very many others that are in existence. The other items in this exhibit all relate to what happened to the USS Houston. The USS Houston was transferred to the Asiatic Fleet in the late 1930s and was the command ship for that fleet. When World War II broke out, it took part in very significant battles at the very beginning of the war, but was eventually sunk. Over half the crew perished. The other half of the crew became POWs, and some of the items here that you see in the case are related to their experience. The drawing there at the top is related to the POW experience while they created the River Kwai Bridge. Some of you might remember the novel and movie called The Bridge on the River Kwai. That book is all about that POW experience. Here is a photograph that was taken in the 1990s that shows what the current condition of the bridge is. At least at that time, it was still in use. The spike and the piece of wood there actually came from that bridge. The photograph that appears to be taken from a submarine was actually taken from an Australian artillery piece and is possibly the last known photo taken of Houston before it was sunk. The wreckage of the USS Houston was located in 2008. And over in this case, we see a piece of canvas that came from the wreckage site. It was located near the propeller shaft. The last ship that I want to speak about today is the USS Stewart. And here is an example of one of the covers from the ship. In the upper left, you can see how the name Shanghai is spelled out in kanji. The reason why the lettering and word Shanghai is there is that Shanghai was a constant port of call for the Asiatic Fleet. The story of the USS Stewart is an interesting one. During the early part of the war, the USS Stewart was severely damaged and put in dry dock at Java. It was under repair right before Java fell to the Japanese. There was an attempt to sink Stewart before the Japanese could capture it, but the attempt failed. Japanese forces were able to raise the ship, repair it, and send it over to Japan to be used for their effort during the war. Over here, this case has a variety of covers that cover many of the ships that were in the Asiatic Fleet. But what I'd like to point out is this photograph here. The photograph shows USS Stewart as it looked at the end of the war. American forces discovered the ship because they had thought it had been sunk. And as you can see here, it has Japanese markings. What I've shown you today is just a small sample of what you can see in this exhibit. I hope you have the opportunity to come by the museum to see more of the naval cover designs from the Asiatic Fleet. This concludes my presentation, and again, thank you for joining us today. We will now go to some questions. Thank you once again for attending this webinar. And before we go to some questions, I'd like to talk a little bit about the creation of this exhibit. The exhibit took me about 1 year to put together, and I combed through our archives and 3D artifacts for specific items that I thought might fit. I've been asked about what inspired me to create this exhibit. It goes back to my interest in stamp collecting as a young boy. I've been collecting stamps for a long time, and when I joined the museum about 7 years ago, I started to notice that we had quite a collection of not only stamps, but these covers. I had no idea what a naval cover was before I started working here. And I don't know all the intricacies and all the nuances of naval covers, but I enjoyed all the designs that I saw. So I thought, why not create an exhibit related to that? And my initial thought was to use caches that covered 1941 to 1945. We have hundreds of these caches in the collection, but we also have quite a few that are before the war. And not much is written about or presented about the Asiatic Fleet, so I thought that would be a unique way to just focus on one narrow aspect of collecting these naval covers. Right here in front of me, or close to me, are a few examples of what we couldn't include in the exhibit when I narrowed my focus, once I decided to just focus on the Asiatic Fleet. The first example I'm going to show you is a naval cover that was stamped while the US fleet was in Tokyo Bay, just days before the surrender. As I said, I was gonna just go from 41 to 45, and when that didn't work out, that cover didn't work out. Another really interesting one here is one that was postmarked on USS Missouri on the day of the surrender. As you can see here, not all naval covers have caches, but because of the historical significance, that would have been a pretty cool one to exhibit. This other item here, the third item I'm going to show you, is a stereoscopic photo. What it's showing is the American fleet in 1908 in Australia, visiting Australia. That would have been pretty cool to exhibit as well, but wasn't going to get too deep into the history of the Asiatic Fleet. We're just going to use one panel to kind of give a brief overview, and the primary focus was the cover, naval covers. So I didn't get to use that. Now I would like to go on to some questions. First question that I've got here is from Richard. How long will the exhibit be on display? It ends on May 1st. May 1st. It opened on January 14th, and we will conclude May 1st. Got a question from Kent. What other museums have postmark exhibits of U.S. Navy ships? The primary one that I'm aware of is actually online. It's a naval cover museum that's just strictly online. It can give you a thorough understanding of what those are, and from 1908 to current times. Got another question from Tammy. Were the naval covers and ship stationery all printed at the same place? Or were these orders handled locally where the ships were built? The naval covers and stationery were not printed all at the same place, variety of places. And they were not handled locally. No. Got a question from Ron. Is there any monetary value placed on naval covers, similar stamps and coins? Yes, and actually it's a very inexpensive hobby to get into. For just the cost of 2 postage stamps and 2 envelopes, you can get right into the hobby right now. You can send off a letter with a self-addressed stamped envelope to a U.S. Navy ship now and start your collection, and have them stamp the one that you include and mail it back to you. And values for these older ones can range from a few dollars up to $50, $60, depending on the rarity. I think the rarest that I'm aware of are the ones stamped in 1908. I've got another question from Richard. Is there a go-to guide of naval covers? The Naval Covers Society, they have an excellent website, and that Naval Cover Museum both are great resources. Another question from Frederick. You said post offices came about on naval ships in 1908. Do you know the first U.S. Navy ship to have a post office? Independence comes to mind, but I don't believe it was Independence. There were a small handful that started out. I think 8 that started out with post offices, but I don't recall the names. Got a question from Donna. How often was mail to or from ships picked up? I'm not sure of the regularity. Another question from Ron. Was the artwork or drawings for the naval covers from the sailors on their ships? No, actually, I think quite often they had members of the service that created covers for a variety of ships, not just specifically ones that they were associated with. And some that I've seen were created by sailors for other ships. Question from Sally. POW working on the bridge was Native American. Do we know what tribes were enlisted? Unsure. Question from Donna. Where is the museum located? We're located in Fredericksburg, Texas, which is the birthplace of Fleet Admiral Nimitz. Another question from Ron. Are naval covers still used? Yes, they are. Yes, they are. As I mentioned before, this is an easy hobby to get into because you can actually send a letter to a ship, U.S. Navy ship now, and have the beginning of a collection right there. They also create caches currently, just like they did back with these older ones. It's not quite as popular of a hobby right now, but yes. One of the interesting things that I learned from creating this exhibit was a story. One of the collections that we have in the archives is all about the USS Black Hawk, which was assigned to the Asiatic Fleet. It's a pretty thorough collection collected by the historian for the USS Black Hawk Association. And one of the interesting collection of anecdotes that this historian collected had to do with an incident that occurred on the ship in the late 1930s. There was a incident related to the tossing overboard of a potted plant that was a favorite plant that the captain of USS Black Hawk tended. It is believed that that incident is the basis for the mid-1950s stage play movie called Mr. Roberts. There's a very well-known subplot in the film that has to do with a potted plant that was favored by the captain. And Mr. Roberts, at a certain point close to the end of the film, tosses that plant overboard in anger. And supposedly that's related to USS Blackhawk. It's a little factoid. Don't know about the verification of it, but it was interesting nonetheless. It's a favorite movie of mine, so to learn about that was pretty cool. Other than that, just finding out about the variety of ships that were involved in the Asiatic Fleet. I think a lot of people only are aware of some of the ones that had tragedies associated with them, like USS Houston. But there were so many more other ships and so many more other stories related to them. Really wish we could have expanded this exhibit and explored some of those stories, but we had to narrow the focus quite a bit. Another question from William. Do you have a listing of all the ships from which you have covers? If you're asking like all ships from the Asiatic Fleet throughout the war, don't have a complete listing, but most of our covers are listed in our catalog. We have a catalog with the records with everything that's in the collection. I could easily find out if we don't or do have a cover. And I should mention that we are still actively collecting covers. If anybody out there has a naval cover and would be willing to donate it to the museum, we would absolutely be interested. I've got another question from Tammy. What exactly encompasses the Asiatic Fleet? Do you also include the ships in the South Pacific in World War II? Well, the area where the Asiatic Fleet was involved did primarily involve the South Pacific. And this exhibit just strictly focuses on those ships that were in the Asiatic Fleet leading up to the war from roughly 1935 to 1942. Got a question from Donna. Do seamen posting mail have to pay for postage? That I don't have a definite answer for, but I believe they do. Another question from Ron. How would I go about donating a cover to your museum? Well, they can reach out to me if anybody out there has a cover and would like to donate. They can reach me at cmcdougal@nimitzfoundation.org. Let's see, I've got one question here about online. If we have any of these online, we don't currently have any online, but that is certainly an idea for a collection online. We need to have one, and I will suggest that. Well, it looks like that's all for this presentation. And once again, thank you for joining us today.